Many people forget about architecture when they think of art. Architecture is one of the most significant forms of art, and certainly the largest form of art. You remember back in chapter 1, we saw that architecture is a visible guide to a community's need for, well, community. Architecture satisfies a basic universal need for shelter, but it's more than that. Architecture is a symbol of protection and security. It's also created for specific purposes. The earliest buildings were built to provide shelter only. Sometimes these buildings would serve the needs of many families or groups that gathered together. And then as the community's needs expanded, buildings were designed for more specific purposes like government, schools, markets, and churches. Now here's where we're going to go a little out of order from the text. We're first going to look at the basics of building, and then we'll ease back into the text things. There are many types of structural systems in architectural design. Load-bearing construction, also known as stacking and piling, is the simplest method to create a building. It's good for brick, stone, adobe, anything that comes in a blockish form. Think igloo. You take blocks of ice, bigger blocks on the bottom, they get smaller as they go up. This helps to distribute the weight. Now, most of this type of construction have few, if any, openings. Skara Brae in Orkney, Scotland is an excellent example of stacked stone structures. And they even partially earth sheltered these for stability and to protect against the harsh weather that they had there. Post and lintel construction uses a horizontal crosspiece, the lintel, that rests on two uprights, which are the posts. This is a construction method of choice if you want to build an open space or if you want to add windows or doors without damaging the integrity of the structure. Stonehenge is a classic example of post and lintel construction, as are the many hypostyle halls from the Egyptian culture. Now, the Romans perfected the round arch, although this type of arch was also used in ancient Mesopotamia. This was particularly well suited for stone structures. A wooden frame was required until the final stone, the keystone, was set into place. If you were to place numerous arches together, you created a barrel vault. Now, cathedrals of the Romanesque period used this type of architecture to open great heights. The roofs of these buildings were wooden planks that would spread over wooden trusses. The Romans used this style of arch to build their aqueducts. Romanesque architecture is usually pretty blocky and heavy from the outside, but it is more light and airy on the inside. Even the Gateway Arch in St. Louis is a modified round arch. The pointed or the Gothic arch gave builders the opportunity to build taller structures. The pointed arch distributed the weight differently than the round arch, so the structures didn't have to be so massive. Now, this was very popular with the churches. Walls could go higher, allowing the opportunity to get closer to God. The thinner walls could be opened up with windows and lots of them. Now, the height did pose some problems that were easily solved by the use of buttresses, flying buttresses, and piers. The cathedral in Reims, France, is an excellent example of Gothic architecture. And if you look on the picture of the outside of the Reims Cathedral, to the left-hand side, you see all of those kind of arched, lightweight arched looking things that were away from the building and then going and attaching to the building. Those are the flying buttresses. Now, dome construction opened up the interior of buildings even more. They used a shell of rotation, which rotates an arch around a central vertical axis. Now, if the arch is a round Roman arch, then the shell of the rotation is called a hemisphere. Now, some builders carried this even further by building the dome over a drum shape so that the dome could sit higher. Now, many well-known government buildings, including our state capitol in Jefferson City, utilizes a dome. Corbelling is based on post and lintel construction. Each course of stone is stepped, or in other words, they're offset. They may stick out further than the stone below. Now, most corbelling structures are more of a cone shape, and it could be used for an entire structure or just roofs, as in the corbelled roofs of Abellaro Bella, Italy. Now, cast iron was first used back in the Tang Dynasty, which was 618 to 904 AD. It did not become a real popular building material until the Industrial Revolution made it possible to be mass-produced. Now, cast iron gives a building a skeleton, which was the load-bearing portion of a building. So the outside skin could be made of a variety of materials. Now, these buildings could not be very tall as each level supported the levels above. And until the Industrial Revolution, cast iron was fairly brittle. The Crystal Palace was created for the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. Now, this was the first time a building used prefabricated pieces. The cast iron was set up in a shell, and then panels of glass were put together somewhere else and then brought to the location. This building was actually built in less than 9 months. Now, the Eiffel Tower is another example of cast iron building. This time, all of the metal is exposed. So balloon framing is what we're probably the most familiar with. This is a true skeleton and skin type of construction. Improved methods for milling lumber, being able to mass produce nails made this a very popular framing method. The term balloon framing was coined by skeptics of this type of construction. They thought the buildings would fall down or burst like balloons. Two innovations in the late 19th century ushered in the skyscraper: steel-framed construction and the elevator. Now, steel-framed construction allowed a steel cage to be built that would basically support the entire weight of the building. This is how most of our big office buildings and hospitals and those kinds of things are built. All of the weight of the building is on the steel frame. This allowed the use of new materials, which is the skin, including the use of tempered glass for the exterior of the building. Concrete was actually used by the Romans. The nice thing about concrete is that it assumes the shape of any mold that you put it in. It does, however, have a low tensile strength, so it's very prone to cracking without reinforcements. That's why most of the time concrete has rebar running through it. So Le Corbusier in 1952 created what's probably the first full use of concrete, reinforced concrete, in a building. And this was his experiment with it. Worked great, still going strong. The one on the right has very delicate, those scoops. And this is actually an aquarium in Spain. Geodesic dome construction has kind of gone in and out of popularity over the years. It was developed by R. Buckminster Fuller, and it uses a network of triangles, individual triangles that are then set into tetrahedrons. It is very strong construction, and it needs absolutely no interior supports. We are so fortunate to have a terrific example of a geodesic dome in St. Louis at the Missouri Botanical Gardens, the Climatron. It was built in 1960, and it was one of the first enclosed agricultural type of buildings. Now on the right, you can see how a geodesic dome would be used for a house. Now remember, the geodesic dome doesn't have any kind of interior supports. So the challenge would be how to separate the different areas of your building. When we begin discussing form in architecture, we address 5 primary functions for architecture: residential needs, community, government, commerce, and workshop. Now, your book is community and government together, but I split them up. The basic use of a residential structure is to protect from the elements. Those living in those structures, though, need areas to cook, to sleep, and to store items. Early communal centers like Skara Brae used common walls for support, and being earth sheltered, it protected the residents from the harsh climate. As cultures grew and changed, the separation of people by status became more obvious. Rulers and those who were wealthy wanted to look powerful, so their residences were very lavish. Kings and pharaohs also included fortifications in their structures for safety and decorations that would intimidate visitors. Diocletian's palace was built for the Roman Emperor Diocletian as a retirement home. Now, this residence also housed a military garrison. In highly populated areas, multifamily dwellings began to appear. These were the precursors of the apartment building. Now, many of these structures were also multifunctional, with shops on the lower level and living quarters above. These insula, which is Latin for island, housed people of lower or middle class status, and even most of the upper middle class. Now, the upper middle class and upper class had single family residences in a separate part of the city. These single family homes were called domus. Now, later, homes would be built of every material and every style imaginable. Different cultures use different types of areas for community interaction. For some cultures, the community interaction was religious in nature. For others, it was for entertainment purposes. In early Mesopotamia, the ziggurat of Ur in present-day Iraq was built as a man-made mountain, where the temple of worship was elevated closer to the gods. In Rome, the community functions occurred in the Forum, which was a large open space in the center of the city. Now, in addition to government building, which were also community areas, the Forum in Rome was an area suited for many different activities. First, it was an everyday marketplace. Then it was an area for public affairs. Ultimately, forum activities included elections, public speeches, criminal trials, gladiator marches, social gatherings, business and public meetings, religious ceremonies, educational events, and still a marketplace. Now, while many other monuments, statues, and buildings were built in and around the Forum, the Colosseum was built kind of outside of that general area. Many community activities moved out of the Forum. Gladiator fights were performed in the Colosseum, and at one point it was even used as a place to have mock naval fights. They could fill the whole thing up with water and then have naval fights with that. Now, in the United States, we have the National Mall in Washington, D.C., a big, huge open area that is bound by monuments on both ends that is completely for public use. Most recently, architecture, community type architecture has taken many, many different forms. In 1959, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And in 1973, the Sydney Opera House in Sydney, Australia was completed. And the sails on the Sydney Opera House are precast concrete. Government buildings were built to house the judicial and legislative works of a city, state, or country. Many ancient government buildings were also social gathering places. In the United States, most government buildings follow the architectural style of the Greeks and the Romans. The classical stone facade, very symmetrical and grand, implies sturdiness and solidity. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on the left is a very good example of that. Even our Capitol building in Jefferson City is an example of that type of architecture. And believe it or not, on the top of the dome, they have of the Capitol building in Jefferson City is a bronze statue of Ceres, who is the Greek goddess of agriculture. Where there are people, there are markets to buy goods. In ancient Greece, the agora was not only the marketplace, but also a gathering place for social events. In the Middle East, open-air bazaars are the norm, and here in the U.S., while many still shop at smaller grocery stores, a supercenter, the one stop for all, is the norm. The Merchandise Mart in Chicago houses many wholesale showrooms for architects and designers in its 18-story, 4 million square foot building. Every culture has some deity that they worship. In ancient Egypt, they believed the gods lived in the temples they built. Egypt also worshipped their rulers and built, or the ruler built, grand palaces for them to be worshipped by the people. Ancient Greek and Roman architecture used columns, domes, and the like. Here we can see on the left the extensive temple complex at Karnak, Egypt, which would have been around 1500 BC. We have Muslim mosques, we have Islamic temples, all different stylings, all used for worship. The most basic form for Christian churches is actually based on a footprint adapted from Roman public buildings. As it evolved, the Christian church takes on more of a cross shape, especially the big cathedrals. Today, there are churches made from every material in every architectural style. The Wilderness Chapel in Silver Dollar City, the Thorn Crown Chapel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County, California.